Hello, and welcome to the Path of Most Persistence. This is a place where we hear and share tenacious stories of overcoming obstacles with our partners who dare to share a bit of their own personal paths.
Paul Dickman is a Senior Policy Fellow with Argonne National Laboratory in Washington, D.C. He has held senior managerial positions at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy's National Nuclear Security Administration. Early in his career, he managed environmental research projects in the remediation of nuclear weapons testing areas and disposal of highly radioactive materials. He also managed programs for the Waste Isolation Pilot Project and served as principal technical advisor to the director of the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste. Mr. Dickman is a member of the National Academy of Sciences Nuclear and Radiation Sciences Board. He holds leadership positions in the American Nuclear Society and is the president-elect of the World Council on Isotopes. He serves as an advisor to the Japanese government on the decommissioning of the Fukushima accident site. He received his MS in Natural Sciences in Nuclear Chemistry and Physics from the University of Wyoming and his BA in History of Science from the University of Denver. Paul, it's such a pleasure to have you on with us today. Thank you so much for chatting with us.
Hi, Valerie. It's good to see you. It's been a while.
It has been a while, and I wish we could be doing this in person, but we're a few states away from each other, and I know we still have lots of limitations on our travel, but this is second best. And again, it's wonderful to have you on. You have so much experience, and I just love that our audience is going to be able to have a little peek into that. So with all of that in mind, Paul, and because today is March 15th, 2022, I do want to acknowledge the anniversary of the Fukushima Daiichi accident that happened 10 years ago as of March 11th. And you've played a pivotal role in the recovery. So if you would, can you talk a little bit about the incident, what the anniversary means, the status of the whole site, and how things have been managed, not only abroad in Japan, but also globally?
Well, it's today it's still one of those markers in Japan where, well, frankly, the Japanese nuclear power industry is not going to move forward until there is a solid path for the decommissioning of Fukushima Daiichi. And they're getting there. In fact, I think that in the next 2 years, you're going to start to see a lot of movement in that direction. But going back, after the accident, there were a lot of things that were done right and a lot of things that were done wrong. Probably the one thing which was done wrong was really a failure to effectively communicate to the public as to what was going on. And you can point fingers, but at the end of the day, what we found out is that one of the things that people fail to understand is sometimes scientists want to get the answer right before they tell people what's going on. And that turned out to be a huge mistake for a lot of things that happened at Fukushima and elsewhere, even today. So one of the things that I have been focused in on quite a bit recently has been the release of the water from the Fukushima Daiichi site. This has been raised as a major international incident. Particularly the Chinese have been using this as an effort to accuse the Japanese of doing all sorts of things. But the reality is that the Japanese decided early on at the site to start to contain the water that's coming in because they needed to clean it up. It had contamination. They needed to run through purification systems before it could be released into the ocean. Well, one of the residual nuclides is tritium, and tritium is basically a radioactive form of water, and it's produced naturally. And frankly, cosmic rays produce it. The ocean is full of tritium. You are full of tritium because you have water in you. So anything you have that has water in it has tritium in it, and that's just the way it is. It's natural. But nonetheless, the problem is that the utility has reputational damage. That's a Japanese term for it, and people didn't trust them. And so as a result, they were storing water. And right now on the site, they have over 1,000 tanks containing over 1 million metric tons of water, and it's slightly contaminated. And what they should have been doing is they should have been basically cleaning up and releasing it. But they held on to it for a lot of political and social reasons. Again, remember, there was a distrust, but they also had the Olympics coming up. And so they wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be a furor about this. Well, anyway, they made a decision last year that they were going to discharge this treated water into the ocean. And there was a significant outpouring of concern, both domestically as well as internationally. Yet the reality is that they have to go forward and do this, because the site right now needs to get going with decommissioning of what are higher risk materials. The tritiated water is a very, very low risk material. In fact, it's so low that the Japanese regulator chairman said that he didn't even consider it to be a regulatory concern. So, when your safety authority basically dismisses it and says, well, you're storing and treating the water because you're doing it not for safety purposes. Okay, that's what he was saying. It was a political and social issue. So, but now what we have is that they're going to go ahead and they're going to release this water. And one of the things that I think we have to be concerned about, and one of the things that I've been writing about and talking about, is that when you see safety authorities in Korea and Japan, and China, basically being silent about their government's accusations that the Japanese are basically going to be contaminating the ocean. This is a problem because every single nuclear power plant in the world generates tritium and releases it. Yeah. And so here you have China or Korea with almost 30 reactors. I think China's up to 30 or 40 reactors right now, and they're releasing tritium every day. And yet they're accusing the Japanese of all sorts of issues, and they're releasing this lightly contaminated water from the Fukushima site. So what does that mean? It means that the safety authorities, by basically being silent, are ultimately, not butting in and saying this is not of safety significance. And how does that going to affect their own licensing authority in the future? So this is a big problem in my view. And so I was very glad to see the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, several organizations, major organizations, come to the defense of the Japanese. And I will tell you that this administration jumped out right away and supported this Japanese decision. And that was really an important moment when you have the Secretary of State of the United States and actually putting out a statement acknowledging and applauding the Japanese decision. It shows that this was treated at the very highest level of the U.S. government, and they were right. This is something the Japanese needed to do, and we applaud them for going forward, because they have to spend their time getting to the core debris in the melted reactors, not worrying around with this little tiny risk issue, which is this tritiated water. So that's kind of my summary of what's going on. And by the way, one of the things that Japanese are doing, which has been a kind of a fascinating development, is their use of robotics in terms of doing examination of the core debris. And they are really advancing this. And this is going to be a technology which is going to be beneficial for all sorts of parts of the nuclear industry. Because we do need to do maintenance of reactors and other things, and radiation is a concern. But if we can develop robots that are radiation hardened, they can perform those same functions that humans do now, then that's going to be a tremendous savings in terms of both time and manpower.
This is all so informative and good to hear, Paul. And one of the things that I appreciate about you from the very beginning when we first met, feels like, oh my goodness, many years ago now. But you have this way of explaining things that the general public can comprehend, because sometimes, especially people, with your stature or your background, can get very technical. And for those that don't have the background or the technical knowledge or information, it can just become a little confusing. It can sometimes even be off-putting because it can, be so much. But you have a wonderful way of explaining it in a way that the general public understands. So thank you for that. And that was one of the delights of having you on today, because I knew you would be a wonderful person to do that. You mentioned so many items that I'm going to have to go back to, if you don't mind. So be patient with me as we zigzag through this conversation. But one of the things that you mentioned communication, and communication is key. Personally, politically, economically. So I think, again, with the general public being the majority of our audience, how can we as individuals not only better communicate, but also be better listeners into maybe the news that we consume, or just the general discussions around us when it comes to nuclear topics? Can you help us with that?
Let me back up for a second and say that there's really two types of communication. There's risk communication, and then there's crisis communication, okay? And we have to be able to articulate both, and we have to convey to the public what the differences are. So risk communication is what I do to teach you about what's going on. In crisis communication, I tell you what you need to do, because I can't educate you. You got to do this. You got to get out of here. You got to do this. So what's happened is that when things are at a crisis point, we tend to want to try to educate people on radiation and what they ought to be doing, to understand radiation. That's not really what they need to know. What they need to know is it safe? And you need to have people who are recognized authorities that people are going to trust, are going to tell them, yes, it's safe, or if it's not safe, what they need to do. And so what we need to do as an industry is we really need to have a good program of educating kindergarten and above. I'm not saying kindergarten, but well, even my grandson's got a book on nuclear physics, and physics for 4-year-olds. Okay. So,
yeah.
But I mean, the point being is that we need to educate people in the sciences, and then we need to educate people who are going to be spokesmen in really understanding the difference between crisis communication and risk communication. And I do want to go back to one thing about, I always tell people I was very lucky in my career. And so I have an undergraduate degree in history, and I like to tell them it's history of science. So why is that? All right. Well, so I was a history major, and unlike most kids who go into college, I actually stuck with that major throughout my entire undergraduate degree. Although my own children, I think, changed their degrees several times. But anyway, but one day I took a class in history of science, and it was taught by this guy who was a physicist. His name was Wolfgang Ugrau. Okay. And he was a well-known physicist. Actually, he was a astrophysicist. Anyway, he taught a fascinating class. And what I realized is that, we know that history changes because of events, because of people, because of war, stuff like that. But we don't necessarily understand how history changes because of scientific discoveries.
Yeah.
And we're going through one right now. Look at the vaccines for COVID. I mean, that is a major a change in the way we're going to treat viruses in the future, and that's what we're going through. So this scientific discovery has already changed history right before us. So in this case, what happened, I realized that I really didn't understand a lot of the stuff that was being taught in this class because I didn't have a science background, and so I ended up taking biology and chemistry and physics and all those things. In fact, I had minors in both biology and chemistry. And then, and so I really enjoyed what I was learning. And and in some ways, it probably in communications better that I had a history degree than a science degree as an undergrad. But anyway, I was able to take that background in science and ultimately went to grad school. And I got lucky again because there was a class being offered that was interesting. It's called nuclear chemistry, and I didn't know what the heck it was. So I called up the prof, and he said to me, said, well, I don't have one of the prerequisites, which was physical chemistry. And he said, well, if you take it simultaneously, we can get you into class. I said, oh, okay. And then he said, and oh, by the way, I'll get you a grant to work on if you take the class.
Wow.
Well, who's going to turn that down, right? So actually, it turned out that he needed one more student. Otherwise, they're going to cancel the course.
Oh my God.
So anyway, 2.5 years later, I ended up with a master's degree in nuclear chemistry and physics. So there you are. So that's, but it was all because of taking a class that really changed the way I thought about how we deal with history, and that is through science. And that gets back to this issue of being able to communicate, because when people really understand the science and they understand how it impacts their daily lives, then that's the sort of thing that really we need to really build off of. As you know, the American Nuke Society actually has a program with the Discovery Channel that introduces a nuclear science and technology into the K through 12, and I think I can't remember how many students have been have that in their classrooms, but it's like well over 1 million. I'll have to get that for you later, but that's the sort of thing that we as professional societies can do, is to help promote the science and technology that's necessary, so that we have an educated and informed citizens, and that's really one of our jobs.
I love that. And thank you. Just a shout out to the American Nuclear Society. Those materials, we have linked to them. So on our website, the Nuclear Power Institute website, we do link to those K-12 resources, because we know that they're valuable and they do assist and provide lots of great material for educators and students. So thank you for reminding me to acknowledge that. But again, Paul, thank you so much for distinguishing between risk and crisis communication. I think that for us, and I say us being in education, that it is so important that we do spend the time on the risk side of things. And I know that it's not always a popular area to spend your resources, because, it's an investment, right? It's a lot of time. It's a lot of can be money. It's a lot of resource to spend that time. And also sometimes a lot of us, and I use air quotes for that, avoid that whole area because it can feel controversial. It can become uncomfortable because you have to talk about risks. But I think if more of us choose to go ahead and do the work beforehand, when crisis comes into effect. Unfortunately, when we are in those times of crisis, those investments really support us, our efforts at that time. So if we, as I like to tell my own children, do what you have to do now so that you can do what you want later. But in this respect, do what you have to do now so that when, unfortunately, those laters come, it's easier to transition to what you must do to get through it. So thank you for the distinction.
As you know, our friend Dale Klein, who
Yes.
is Associate Vice Chancellor of that other school in Texas.
You can say its name, although our Dr. Maroon, you can't say the name.
Anyway, Dale's the Vice Chancellor at the UT, but he's a friend of ours, and I actually worked for Dale when he was chairman of the NRC. But he always used to say, the worst time to go see a politician, or the first time you never want to go see a politician for the first time when you have a problem. You always want to go see him before you have a problem, so that you establish that relationship. And that was always one of my takeaway lessons working with Dale, and he was very good about that. So, and you're right, that's exactly what you want to do. You want to work with the public so they get to understand what you're talking about, and maybe build that trust relationship. Because when a problem comes, it won't be the first time they've seen you.
Well, and I love that. I think that way of thinking is very important, and that transcends all relationships. It doesn't matter if it's with an elected official or if it's with your parent or a friend or a colleague. You want to have those conversations and maintain those conversations before a serious situation arises. So that's great. I want to pivot just a little bit, Paul. You wrote a paper, or you published a paper on the politics of isotopes, and in preparation for today, I was reading through it. And as we began this conversation, I know because I read your paper and it was, a wonderful paper, but you went through some of those bullet points. But one of the things that stands out to me in that document was your triple impact. Can you talk about the triple impact of that paper, what you mean by the triple impact of an incident?
Well, in this particular case, it was the Fukushima Daiichi accident, but it was also the Great Japan earthquake, which hit the Tohoku region. And what people don't realize is that this was a devastating impact to that region. And the people there suffered tremendous loss. It wasn't the accident of Fukushima that compounded it. That was a triple impact. It was the earthquake and the tsunami that basically destroyed the infrastructure. And what people just don't recognize that there were about I think 19,000 people who lost their lives, but there are over 2,000 people whom they've never found their bodies. In large part because those bodies were probably swept out to sea as part of when the tsunami receded, and they'll never be found. So they're missing, and that impacts families. In some villages were almost 30% of the population is wiped out. So when you have an impact of that sort, you have this devastation of this region, and then on top of that you had the Fukushima Daiichi accident occur. This is going to take. It takes years to rebuild. And in this case, what you're going to find, and we've already seen, is 10 years out, some of those townships, which are now open, only 25 to 30% of the original occupants have returned.
Yes.
And it's because they've moved on. I mean, they've been, they were basically out of their homes for 5 or 6 years, and they've made other friends. Their children who move on to other areas, so they're not going to be returning. So that's a major impact to this region, which was and still is a significant agricultural center for Japan. And but it's one of the impacts. That's the triple impact of having something of this sort. So, and I think it's one of those things which I will tell you is very much on the minds of the people who work in this area. The folks at both TEPCO, the utility, the ministries that work in that area, and also the NDF, which is the decommissioning authority for Fukushima. They are always very sensitive to this as an issue, and as a result, I mean, I think that helps to drive the way their sense of urgency for what they want to try to do. They understand they're going to have to. You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, right? And so they're gonna have to make some decisions, and they did that, release the water. But at the end of the day, that's the best thing they could do. But I do want to just, I mean, like I said, I think we focus in on the reactor accident. We don't really focus in on the hundreds of thousands of homes that were destroyed, and I mean, it took them 8 years, 8 years to reestablish the railway system in that area.
Yes. When you think of just the damage, just from the tsunami itself, just that damage in itself, beyond anything else, and to go back to your home that suffered water damage and all the other things after so many years, it has to be hard in every way to go back home and try to reestablish that life you once had or you hope to have again. And hearing you, Paul, talk about that triple impact, I feel like it's reminding me what's going on today in the world and in other countries specifically Ukraine right now. And I think of in those terms, when you think of the triple impact of things, as far as the humanity of it, the social, and not to really delve into politics so much, but the economic impacts. And with that, with the Fukushima accident 10 years ago, what's currently going on in the world, how is it that we in the nuclear sector and in education, how can we better have those discussions about nuclear power? What is the state of nuclear power, not only globally in certain regions, but also in the US? Is there still a need for it? Do we need to keep pursuing it? Do we need to look to other energy sources with all that we've been through, what's going on now, and as we look to the future? What's your perspective?
Well, obviously, I believe we do need it, and I think the situation in Ukraine kind of proves the point about energy security. One thing that people tend to forget about is that a typical nuclear power plant has stored on the site at least a year, sometimes two years worth of fuel there. So they don't have to worry about supply interruptions. They've got the fuel on board. They can operate their plants for at least a year or more. And I think that's an important part. And I do think that we have to consider, because it's already being said, this issue about the Russians taking over the power plants and also Chernobyl. And I want to say two quick things about Chernobyl, because that tends to be one of those iconic issues, and it's always brought up because it was a terrible accident and it was avoidable. Frankly, they were doing tests that the Russians had asked them to do, and anyway. They had 4 reactors. They're all decommissioned. There's no chance of any reoccurrence of that sort. The fuel's being stored in a pool, and there's a lot of concern because the power was shut off. And this is where the misinformation comes in. You need to really basically be able to have people that people view as credible, and tell people, look, that fuel is in a stable state. It's covered with water. The pumps don't need to work in order for it to stay cool. You do need to run a garden hose there to replace what's being evaporated, but that's literally about it. It's only a garden hose in order to refill the tank. But that's the sort of information that gets conveyed. And I will say that I've been very impressed by some of the reporting that is being done by this, because I think everybody is aware of what happened in Fukushima and what they got wrong, particularly in the media. And so I've seen, colleagues of mine who are somewhat on the opposite side of the nuclear issue have been very good about pointing this out. It's not an issue. What concerns me about the other plants is something which we all need to appreciate, which is a human factor. You have these plant operators who've been there. Their plants are being taken over by the military. I won't say they're being held hostage, but they're certainly confined. They're in a war zone. Their families are in a war zone. They're cut off from communication with their families and from other parts of and this gets to be very stressful. And so after a while, to be blunt about it, mistakes are going to happen. And that's what really concerns us in the industry. But I'll give you an example in the United States. I think it's an important point. When we have the hurricanes coming into town, the Gulf and Florida, the nuclear utilities, in fact, all the utilities, bring in outside crews to operate those plants, because they know the most important thing is for their employees to take care of their families. Because if their families are in harm's way, that's where their attention is going to be, not on running the plants. So it's very common for industries, particularly the nuke industry, to bring in outside crews from regions that will not be impacted by the weather or hurricane, whatever, to operate the plants so they can be maintained in a safe operating condition. And that you can't do right now in Ukraine.
Right.
So for us, I think all of us are concerned about the operators there. Bluntly, I don't think anybody's really been that concerned about the Russians actually doing something with the plants, which is always kind of the science fiction part of the story, because those are valuable assets and they need them. because those plants provide over 50% of the electricity for Ukraine, and they need that in order to maintain the structures there. So these are important assets. Um, what I think, I'm not sure what will happen because there's a lot of things in play. But at the end of the day, I think what we recognize is that those plants are so valuable that even in a war, the opposing side really wants to protect them.
Yes.
And it's not just because of radiological reasons, which is obviously, but because they're a tremendously valuable infrastructure, and they need to occupy them in order to preserve them. So I suspect that's one issue. Now, how does that reflect on a couple of, I do also want to mention one other thing. After Fukushima, one of the actually impacts in Fukushima is all the nuclear utilities around the world really started to look at how do they strengthen their safety systems, particularly to deal with things like station blackout. And believe it or not, the Ukrainians, these are Russian reactors, but the Ukrainians actually adopted American and European safety standards. And they've been participating in the European Union's stress tests, which are to test the systems and follow the safety guidelines that the US and the Europeans implemented after Fukushima. So these are fairly robust safety programs they have in Ukraine, including adopting the American standard, which is called the FLEX system. Okay, and so they adopted that, and in fact, the U.S. helped support them in adopting that. So from a safety standpoint, they're certainly well equipped and managed to address anything that relates with station blackout issues like what happened at Fukushima. And I think that's an important point which people need to understand and communicate. Now, getting back to the global nature, where is nuclear in this country? Well, two things I got to say. Nuclear is in trouble in the U.S. because of cheap natural gas. I mean, that's a fact. You guys are out drilling in the Permian Basin too much, all right? But what that also means is that with Europe deciding to wean itself from Russian gas, it means the U.S. is in a position to start to export. So I see the price of natural gas increasing, and as a result, the economic stress on nuclear, which nuclear really can't compete with natural gas. It's just more expensive.
Right.
But when natural gas starts to increase in price, then the attractiveness of nuclear is going to grow. So I can see that happening. You're starting to see the Europeans starting to rethink whether or not you should close those nuclear power plants. In Germany, there have been protests about closing the three plants there. I don't know whether they'll change their minds, but they're certainly rethinking. The Belgians are rethinking it. So what we're seeing is that people recognize the value of having an energy infrastructure that literally you can store a year or two's worth of fuel right there on site.
Yes.
And that makes a big difference when you're looking at the global market. So I think that's a positive aspect. In this country, we're still on the path to basically reducing our coal plants and hydrocarbon plants. And the only way you can really do that effectively and still maintain a good power grid is you do have to have base load. I mean, as we know, wind and solar are intermittent, and when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, you don't produce electricity. So from those plants, and what you do is you run gas plants. You burn gas in gas turbines to produce the electricity the wind and solar aren't making. So in the meantime, what you have to do is you have to have base load on the grid, and nuclear is probably the cleanest. Nuclear and hydro are the two cleanest ways to produce that base load on the grid. And I think the utilities have they have a hard time introducing new nuclear because it's expensive, it takes time, and there's a significant safety and regulatory process they go through. But at the end of the day, I think the public utility commissions are going to look at this and say, we need to have that resilient infrastructure, and I think you're going to start to see more nuclear grow. although it won't be the bigger plants. I think we'll start to see these smaller plants come in because they can replace some of the coal units. They can replace some of the even the gas units can be replaced by nuclear in some areas. As you know, TerraPower announced that they were going to go into Cameron, Wyoming, and put a small unit there. Of course, being from Wyoming, I can tell you, I've driven through Cameron many times, and I always tell people, well, if you're going 30 miles an hour, don't blink, you'll miss it. Okay, so and that actually is an interesting problem because one of the things that we have to be concerned about is getting back to education.
Yes.
These are small towns. I think Cameron's got 3,500 people in it or something like that. And now you're going to put a nuclear power plant there. And with that comes a lot of issues. Some of them are social and political, but just basic education as to how the plant operates, what they need to do. There's a lot of things that go with that. And that's something which we in the nuclear community really ought to be thinking about as we start to have more distributed small plants, is how do we educate local organizations on what that power plant means. This gets back to the risk communication aspect we're talking about, and that becomes a job of universities, of institutes like yours, and professional societies. We need to think about how to do that.
Thank you for that. And as you were speaking, I'm reminded of growing up in Texas, 12 miles away from the South Texas project. I was born and reared here. So when that came into town and they were starting to break ground, I remember all the concerns, all the issues from not only just the general public, but from farmers, because it's a very large farming community, and also the shrimping community, because it is a huge shrimping community. So there was a lot of concern. There was a lot of concern that the workforce was coming in. A lot of them were coming in from other states. And being in a very small county, a very small community, there was lots of misinformation and misunderstanding. But what I do remember as a young child, and of course now that I'm able to reflect back on some of the things and have those discussions with some of those individuals that had major roles, it was interesting that they did take a lot of proactive steps. Now, I don't know if it was at the very, very beginning or it was through lessons learned as they went through the process, but I remember them spending lots of effort with teachers, mothers in the community that were those that had influence, asking them to go on a bus to go visit the site and things like that to demystify the situation. So I remember that there's a lot of fear and concern, and that just goes back again, that re-stresses the fact of communication, that risk versus crisis communication, and the investment in risk communication it never goes away. It's always there, and the more we take advantage of it, we all would benefit.
Absolutely. I think this is something which we have to work at all the time, and we have to look at all these avenues. I want to just reflect back on the days when I worked at the Nevada test site, and we were still doing nuclear weapons testing in those days. So, but one of the things that we did as part of our education was we basically bought a weather station at every high school and had the science teachers operate it.
So smart.
And so, they did the monitoring, they did all this other stuff, but they also got all the information about what was going on. And that's how you kind of drive information down to a local level, because it's, the high school teacher is the one, people say, well, what's going on down there? Well, if that's your neighbor and they're informed, well, you tend to trust your neighbor more than you do the newspaper or something that the government's sending out, right? So that was one of the ways that in those days, the Atomic Energy Commission, and later, of course, DOE, really did try to provide that avenue of communication that you need to have to build confidence in your communities.
When you talk about those programmings, of course, I'm in agreement, because that is in alignment with what we do. But it makes me think too of your leadership, your participation in the American Nuclear Society, Paul, ANS. Can you talk a little bit about the mission of ANS, what you all are doing for young people, for professionals? What do you do, and how do you build the workforce in your own capacity?
Well, that's a great topic, because of course I could talk for an hour on that, but
Love it.
I'll make it short. There's two things about ANS. We advocate for the profession and not the industry, and I want to make that as a distinction. We have organizations like Nuclear Energy Institute. They're the ones who really are industry advocates. But what we're concerned about is the development of professionals in our industry and our science. And Craig Piercy, who's the CEO or the executive director of ANS, always made this very interesting. He says, industry worries about electrons, and ANS worries about neutrons. And that's kind of a very important distinction, because we're not in the business of making electricity. We're in the business of using neutrons to do all sorts of things, right? From medical isotopes to power reactors to sending things into space, whatever you want to. That's our job. Is we focus in on those issues that develop the science and the technology necessary. So, with that in mind, I think one of the things that you and I have talked about, and one of the things that I continue to be concerned about, is development of young professionals. It's very important. We learn a lot just by sitting next to somebody sometimes. Okay, and now we're only sitting next to each other in boxes on a screen. And so it's a little harder to communicate. And I always say, the worst thing about this is that if you're sitting next to somebody and they start to say something wrong, you can kick them under the table. Well, it's a little hard to kick them under the table when they're just a box on the screen. Yeah, that's how we learn. Is sometimes when somebody says, Joe, Sam, Sally, that's not right. You got to do this. You got to do that. And so we need to have that interaction in order to grow ourselves and our fellows, and particularly young professionals who don't really have right now. They live in a virtual world and environment. So what I think is important is for them to get engaged in things like professional societies, because that way they actually start to see people outside of the work area, but who are still involved in their topic. And so whether it be the American Nuclear Society, the Society for Mechanical Engineers, I don't care what you are, joining with other professionals outside of your job or your company really helps grow you, and you get to understand a lot about what's going on, and you get a lot of insights from just working in those areas. So I'm a huge proponent of doing this, and that's one of my stump speeches. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to stump on that, because I think that everybody who's in, particularly with today's virtual world, which is becoming larger, this is something which we need to do. We need to focus in on development of professionals, and it's not just in their jobs; it's outside their jobs.
Absolutely. It's always finding, and at some point I want to get to it in our conversation, how you seem to have such a wonderful way, Paul, of finding that balance between work, family, and all your professional endeavors, if it's associations or different types of committees. I want to hear how you find that balance. But before we leave ANS, what over these past few years in the whole COVID era, what do you feel are some of the great accomplishments of ANS, or maybe not accomplishments, but maybe initiatives, endeavors of how you've tried to, as an organization, as a society, had to support or remediate?
Yeah. Well, I got to give credit to Craig Piercy, who was the executive director. He has done a tremendous amount in transforming to deal with this. I mean, we basically pivoted from a in-person organization to a virtual organization almost overnight, and that is and to find mechanisms to continue to be engaged. And so we've got a series of webinars. We did we got the young professionals to actually host in multiple labs to basically talk about what programs are. So these are, and this is something which we have done really to kind of backfill because we don't have in-person meetings anymore. Okay, so so this is broadened our perspective. I will tell you, we had a revisit on Fukushima, and we had almost 1,000 people attended virtually. Now we could never have done that. It was a 1 hour, 1.5 hour seminar, and we brought together the people who helped write the ANS Fukushima report. I was a study director for that. So, and it was kind of amazing how many people we had sign up and attend that. And we could never have done that if it had been an in-person meeting, but we were able to accomplish that through virtual meetings. And that's what a lot of organizations like ours are trying to do in terms of growing their membership and sustaining their members by providing them programs which are short enough and easily accessible that they can actually participate in what's going on. The other thing that we've done a lot recently, and I think this is an important aspect, is we work with people in Washington, D.C. on the Hill. And we get asked questions a lot. And I can tell you right now what's going on with Ukraine. We get asked a lot of questions by people who are Senate and congressional staffers, from other NGOs, because they come to us for our contacts. We have a lot of contacts with the Ukrainian Nuclear Society, and we have members there, and we have members all over the world who understand what's going on with those reactors. And so we become a conduit for information, and people appreciate it because we're not really trying to sell anything. We're just trying to tell people what we know. And that's another aspect about what ANS has done in terms of becoming I don't want to say an honest broker, but it's the, again, we get back to the issue that we're interested in the neutrons, not the electrons. So we're not selling anything, except our membership. So be sure to sign up. All right.
Absolutely. We'll make sure to link that. But Paul, thank you. And I'm noticing the time, and I want to respect your time. I know your time is precious. But as we begin to close out, I want to go back to that balance, that work-family balance that you seem to just have perfectly done. So talk about that if you would, Paul.
Well, first of all, you better have a good spouse, all right, who puts up with you. So I'm proud to say that, we celebrate our 40th anniversary. So
well, congratulations.
Thanks. You see, people who do get married in Vegas on New Year's Eve still can stick around for 40 years. And that's what we did.
Is this a true story, Paul?
That's a true story. Yeah, I was working at a test site, and my fiance, we're in the process of buying a house. We were going to have a wedding, that summer at her parents' home. But I was the short guy on the duty roster because I was the newcomer, right? So I'd only been there for about 6 months, and so I pulled New Year's Eve, I pulled Christmas Eve, right? We always get those, and so they let us out at noon. I called up my my soon-to-be wife and said, "Hey, something? We can save a bunch of money on taxes if we get married, right?"
Okay, I need to know right now. Did Elvis marry you guys? Because if he did,
no, it was tacky enough. We just decided we were the justice of the peace. All right, so $25 for a license, $25 for justice of peace, done, and we're still married. So but I mean, really, it is. It's all of our personal relationships are important, and the kids are important. But at the end of the day, it's our friends that we work with all the time. They give you that special, that make the time for you, and they also tolerate you when you're under stress or maybe you forget to do something. So anyway, I just think it's what makes successful people are their professional and their personal relationships.
Oh my goodness. I'm so, thank you for saying that. And it coming from you means everything, because I had to bring it up in this conversation, because it seems over the years that the times that our paths do cross, you always bring up your family. And I love it. You mention your wife and your children and your grandchildren. And that is so lovely to hear, because not only are you an outstanding, very well respected professional, you obviously love your family and they love you. So it's lovely to hear someone that has all those wonderful blessings in their life. So thank you for sharing that, Paul.
Thank you.
Now, before we really do begin to close out, I want to ask you, is there anything that you were hoping to mention that I didn't give you the opportunity yet? Is there anything you'd like to say before we close out?
Just that I think, going back to the title of your program, people really need to, particularly young people, really need to look at those opportunities, because there's a lot out there, and don't be timid about asking. I think that's one of the things that I found to be a little bit disappointing sometimes, is that people, younger folks, younger professionals, are reluctant to ask because they're afraid they may not, the answer may not be something they want to hear. But that's not what they should do. They you need to ask, because those opportunities won't come your way if you don't. That's kind of it. Like I said, I am where I am today because I asked questions. And I like I said, I was lucky. So, because I guess I asked the right questions. That's all.
Oh, I think you did. It's obvious you did. Paul, thank you so much for chatting with me today. Again, we met many years ago, and every time those occasional paths that cross, we meet up or are able to chat. It's always such a joy, not only because you're such a kind and lovely individual, but your professionalism and your enthusiasm for the field and supporting young people, professionals, is just admirable. So thank you for that. And to our audience, I hope you've listened to this entire conversation. If you haven't, I hope you do, as well as listening to all the other conversations. And as we close out, let's be like Paul. Let's ask the questions. Let's not be afraid to ask the questions so that we can find out new paths, new opportunities, and make this world a whole lot better. Thank you and have a great day.